Margaret, Maggie Thompson, had spent 42 years learning that dignity could be worn like armor, even when the world insisted on treating you like debris. Once, her fingers had commanded standing ovations at Carnegie Hall, her name whispered in reverence among classical music circles from Boston to Vienna. But life had other plans: a mother's devastating stroke, crushing medical bills, and the quiet sacrifice that transformed a celebrated pianist into a night janitor at Boston's most prestigious arts academy. Now she moved through Whitmore Academy's marble corridors like a ghost, her worn uniform and weathered hands marking her as invisible to the wealthy donors and privileged students who populated these hallowed halls. They saw only what they wanted to see: the help, the nobody, the woman whose existence barely registered on their radar of importance. But tonight, as fate would have it, their star performer lay unconscious in Massachusetts General Hospital, leaving a $50 million fundraising gala without its centerpiece, Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. The Academy's survival hung in the balance, and in their desperation they would turn to the one person they'd spent months treating like human furniture. They thought she was just another casualty of circumstance. They were catastrophically wrong. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from. And make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The crystal chandeliers of Whitmore's Grand Auditorium cast their golden glow over 800 of New England's most influential figures, their combined net worth exceeding several small nations' GDP. Tech moguls who'd built empires from Silicon Valley garages now sat beside old money Brahmins, whose families had shaped American history for 3 centuries. The air thrummed with the electricity of power and prestige. Senators rubbing shoulders with Grammy winners, pharmaceutical heiresses chatting with museum directors, all united in their shared belief that culture belonged to those who could afford it. Director Victoria Ashworth, resplendent in her $15,000 Valentino gown, had orchestrated this evening as her crowning achievement, a night that would cement Whitmore's reputation as America's premier cultural institution. But now, with renowned pianist Victor Sterling fighting for his life after a devastating car accident on the Massachusetts Turnpike, her carefully constructed empire teetered on the edge of collapse. The vultures were already circling: rival academies, hungry journalists, board members whose loyalty extended only as far as their tax deductions. In the staff quarters below, panic had transformed seasoned professionals into frantic amateurs, their desperate phone calls yielding nothing but voicemail messages and polite rejections. No virtuoso in their right mind would attempt Rachmaninoff's most demanding concerto with 0 rehearsal time, especially not in front of an audience that included 3 Pulitzer Prize winners and the cultural correspondent for the New York Times. Then, like a whisper cutting through a hurricane, came the suggestion that would change everything: the janitor could play. The words hung in the air like a blasphemous joke, drawing incredulous laughter from professors who'd spent decades cultivating their refined sensibilities. But young Emma Collins, a scholarship violinist whose own humble origins made her sensitive to invisible talent, had heard something in Maggie's humming during those late-night cleaning sessions, something that spoke of depths far beyond her station. As the suggestion rippled through the backstage chaos, transforming from desperate joke to reluctant consideration, the machinery of cruelty began to turn. Here was their scapegoat, their perfect fall guy, the nobody who could absorb the blame when this prestigious evening crumbled into ruins. They would put her on that stage not because they believed in her, but because her failure would be so spectacular, so utterly predictable, that it might actually provide entertainment value for their restless audience. What they didn't understand, what their privilege and prejudice had blinded them to, was that they were about to witness the resurrection of a legend they'd never bothered to recognize. The catastrophe began at 6:47 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, when Victor Sterling's black Mercedes sedan collided with a delivery truck on Interstate 93, just 12 miles from Whitmore Academy. The renowned pianist, who had commanded stages from Lincoln Center to the Sydney Opera House, lay unconscious in Massachusetts General Hospital's trauma unit. His hands, those miraculous instruments that had earned him 3 Grammy nominations, wrapped in bandages and uncertainty. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. America's most celebrated interpreter of Rachmaninoff would miss the performance of his career, leaving behind a $50 million fundraising gala that had taken 18 months to orchestrate, and the reputations of Boston's cultural elite hanging by the thinnest of threads. Victoria Ashworth paced the marble corridors of Whitmore Academy like a caged lioness, her $15,000 Valentino gown rustling with each frantic step. At 58, she had clawed her way to the directorship through 3 decades of calculated networking, strategic marriages, and the kind of ruthless ambition that turned charity galas into blood sport. Her perfectly coiffed blonde hair, maintained weekly at Newbury Street's most exclusive salon, remained immaculate despite the crisis, but her ice-blue eyes betrayed the panic coursing through her veins. The guest list read like a who's who of American power. Senator Patricia Whitman, tech mogul Jonathan Chen, whose net worth exceeded that of several small countries, pharmaceutical heiress Caroline Rothschild, and 3 Pulitzer Prize winners whose presence alone could make or break cultural institutions. Outside, a convoy of black limousines stretched for 6 city blocks, their occupants sipping Dom Perignon, while waiting for an evening that promised to elevate Whitmore Academy into the stratosphere of American cultural prestige. Find someone, anyone, who can play Rachmaninoff's Second Concerto, Victoria barked at her assistant Lucas, a nervous Harvard graduate whose family connections had secured him this position despite his obvious incompetence. His trembling fingers clutched an iPad displaying a rapidly shrinking list of available pianists, each crossed out with increasingly desperate red marks. Martha Argerich was performing in Vienna. Lang Lang had a sold-out concert in Los Angeles. Even the second-tier professionals were booked solid or demanding fees that would bankrupt the Academy's entire annual budget. The harsh reality settled over the backstage area like a funeral shroud. No classically trained pianist in their right mind would attempt one of the most technically demanding pieces in the repertoire with 0 rehearsal time, especially not in front of an audience that included the New York Times chief cultural correspondent and 3 board members from the National Endowment for the Arts. It was then that Emma Collins, a 20-year-old violin scholarship student from rural Vermont, made the suggestion that would change everything. Emma had grown up in a farmhouse where her grandmother's upright piano served as the family's only luxury, where she'd learned to appreciate music not as a status symbol but as pure expression. Her simple navy dress, purchased from a discount store in Burlington, marked her as an outsider among Whitmore's designer-clad elite, but her keen ear had caught something the others had missed. During those late-night practice sessions when the Academy's hallways echoed with emptiness, she had heard Maggie humming complex classical passages while mopping floors, her voice carrying the kind of musical sophistication that couldn't be faked. "The janitor," Emma said quietly, her words cutting through the backstage chaos like a blade. "Maggie Thompson. I've heard her humming Rachmaninoff. She knows the piece." The suggestion landed like a bomb in a cathedral. Professor Diana Whitfield, whose silk Hermes scarf cost more than most people's monthly rent, actually laughed. A sharp, cruel sound that echoed off the Academy's marble walls. At 62, Diana had spent 4 decades building her reputation as one of Boston's most respected piano instructors, her student roster reading like a catalog of America's musical aristocracy. Her perfectly manicured fingers, adorned with rings worth more than a luxury automobile, gestured dismissively toward the service corridors where Maggie worked. "The cleaning lady?" she scoffed, her voice dripping with the kind of condescension that had made her legendary among Whitmore's faculty. "This is Rachmaninoff, not chopsticks. We're talking about 800 of the most influential people in New England, not some community center talent show." But desperation makes strange bedfellows, and Victoria's options had dwindled to exactly 0. The alternative, canceling the gala and facing the wrath of donors who had flown in from as far as California, would mean professional suicide and the likely closure of an institution that had shaped American classical music for over a century and a half. Her calculating mind, honed by decades of cultural warfare, began to see the twisted logic in the situation. If Maggie failed spectacularly, and how could she not, the blame would fall squarely on the janitor's shoulders, leaving Victoria and her staff blameless victims of an impossible situation. The narrative would write itself. Whitmore Academy, faced with an unprecedented crisis, had given an opportunity to the common woman, only to have their generosity thrown back in their faces. It was perfect scapegoating disguised as democratic idealism. The hunt for Maggie began immediately, with Lucas dispatching maintenance staff to scour the Academy's labyrinthine corridors. They found her in the East Wing's practice rooms, methodically cleaning piano benches with the same quiet precision she brought to every task. When the summons came, delivered by a breathless janitor who could barely contain his mixture of excitement and dread, Maggie set down her cleaning supplies with the deliberate care of someone who had learned to find dignity in the smallest gestures. Her walk to the backstage area became a gauntlet of whispered cruelties, faculty members and advanced students lining the hallways like spectators at a Roman execution. The mockery began before she even entered the room. Brandon Hayes, a 22-year-old composition major whose father owned 3 recording studios in Nashville, had already started filming with his iPhone, his 50,000 TikTok followers about to witness what he confidently predicted would be the most spectacular failure in classical music history. "This is going to be epic," he whispered to his camera, his privileged smirk reflecting the casual cruelty that social media had made acceptable. Chelsea Morgan, whose influencer career had been built on documenting the failures of others, positioned herself for the perfect angle, her designer handbag worth more than Maggie's annual salary serving as a prop in her carefully curated aesthetic of superiority. When Maggie finally stood before Victoria and the assembled faculty, the contrast was almost comical. Her simple gray dress, purchased years ago from a department store clearance rack, hung loosely on her frame, wrinkled from a day spent bending and reaching and scrubbing. Her brown hair, streaked with premature gray from years of stress and sacrifice, was pulled back in a practical ponytail that had never seen the inside of a salon. Her hands, those miraculous instruments that had once commanded standing ovations, were marked by calluses and small scars, the inevitable badges of manual labor. She stood there quietly, her hazel eyes steady despite the circle of predators surrounding her, waiting for Victoria to deliver what everyone assumed would be her professional death sentence. "Play Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, Victoria commanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. "Play it perfectly, or clean out your locker and never set foot in this academy again." The ultimatum hung in the air like a guillotine blade, its implications clear to everyone present. This wasn't an opportunity. It was an execution disguised as a chance, a public humiliation designed to remind everyone of their proper place in the cultural hierarchy that governed institutions like Whitmore Academy. The walk to the stage became a procession of shame, with faculty members and students forming an impromptu corridor of cruelty. Professor Whitfield's voice carried clearly as she stage-whispered to a colleague, "At least we'll have someone to blame when the Times reviews tomorrow's disaster." Brandon's phone captured every step, his commentary providing a running narrative of anticipated failure for his growing audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced with the practiced delivery of a seasoned content creator, "you're about to witness the most spectacular crash and burn in classical music history. The janitor thinks she can play Rachmaninoff. This is going to be absolutely brutal." As Maggie emerged onto the stage, the auditorium's 800 guests fell into a stunned silence that quickly transformed into barely suppressed laughter. These were people accustomed to the finest things in life. Their combined net worth exceeded the GDP of several developing nations, and the sight of a cleaning woman in a wrinkled dress approaching their sacred Steinway struck them as either an elaborate joke or a sign of Whitmore's complete desperation. Edward Vance, whose pharmaceutical empire had made him one of Boston's most influential donors, leaned toward his wife with a smirk that spoke volumes about his expectations. "This should be entertaining," he murmured, his diamond cufflinks catching the stage lights as he raised his champagne glass in a mock toast. The humiliation was systematic and deliberate, each whispered comment and stifled laugh designed to remind Maggie of her place in their carefully constructed social order. Tara Clean, the cultural reporter whose reviews could make or break careers, had already begun typing her story, the headline practically writing itself. "Whitmore Academy's Desperate Gamble, When Janitors Think They're Musicians." Her live stream, initially intended to capture Victor Sterling's triumphant return to Boston, had pivoted to documenting what she confidently predicted would be the most spectacular failure in the Academy's distinguished history. But as Maggie approached the magnificent Steinway Model D Concert Grand, an instrument worth more than most people's homes, something shifted in the atmosphere. Her posture straightened, her shoulders squared, and for just a moment the wrinkled dress and scuffed shoes seemed to fade into irrelevance. She sat at the bench with the deliberate grace of someone who belonged there, her hands hovering over the keys like a pianist preparing for the performance of her lifetime. The audience leaned forward, their cruel anticipation mixed with a growing sense that they might be witnessing something unexpected, something that would challenge every assumption they had made about talent, worth, and the invisible boundaries that separated their world from hers. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of profound quiet that settles over a cathedral at midnight, where even the whisper of breath seemed sacrilegious. 800 of New England's most powerful figures sat frozen in their velvet seats, champagne glasses suspended halfway to their lips, their collective breath held as if the very act of exhaling might shatter whatever spell was about to unfold. The massive Steinway Model D Concert Grand, worth more than most people's homes, gleamed under the blazing spotlights like an altar awaiting its sacrifice. Maggie Thompson, in her wrinkled gray dress and scuffed flats, appeared impossibly small against the instrument's imposing presence, yet something had shifted in the auditorium's atmosphere, a subtle change that even the most cynical observers couldn't quite dismiss. Her hands hovered over the keys for what felt like an eternity, though the wall clock's second hand had moved only twice. In that suspended moment, the cruel laughter that had echoed through the hall just seconds before seemed to belong to another lifetime. Another world where dignity could be purchased with designer gowns and social status measured in stock portfolios. Victoria Ashworth, still clutching her microphone like a weapon, found herself unable to speak, her prepared commentary dying in her throat as she watched this woman, this janitor she had tormented for months, transform before her eyes. The transformation wasn't physical. Maggie's dress remained wrinkled. Her hair still escaped its practical ponytail. Her shoes still bore the scuffs of honest labor. But something deeper had awakened, something that made the auditorium's opulent surroundings fade into irrelevance. When Maggie's fingers finally touched the keys, Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 didn't simply begin. It exploded into existence with the force of a dam bursting after years of pressure. The opening chords crashed through the auditorium like thunder rolling across the New England countryside, each note carrying the weight of suppressed dreams and silent dignity. But this wasn't merely technical proficiency, this was music as autobiography. Every phrase telling the story of a woman who had sacrificed her gifts for love, who had endured mockery with grace, who had cleaned the floors of a temple to art while carrying a cathedral of music within her soul. The audience, prepared for disaster, found themselves witnessing something approaching the divine. The concerto's famous opening, those haunting bell-like chords that Rachmaninoff had crafted to represent his own resurrection from creative despair, took on new meaning under Maggie's interpretation. Each chord rang out with crystalline clarity, building tension not through volume, but through the sheer emotional weight she invested in every note. Her technique was flawless, her fingers dancing across the keys with the precision of a Swiss chronometer, but it was the soul behind the technique that transformed the performance from mere execution into transcendence. The melody, when it emerged through the orchestra's strings and clarinet, seemed to weave itself around her accompaniment like golden thread through silk, creating a tapestry of sound that left even the most jaded critics speechless. Professor Diana Whitfield, whose silk Hermes scarf had cost more than Maggie's monthly salary, felt her carefully constructed world of musical hierarchy crumbling with each passing measure. Her mouth, which had delivered countless cutting remarks about proper breeding and natural talent, hung open in stunned recognition of genius that couldn't be purchased, inherited, or faked. The rapid, oscillating arpeggios that accompanied the main theme, passages that would challenge even conservatory-trained professionals, flowed from Maggie's hands like water from a mountain spring, effortless and pure. The audience leaned forward unconsciously, their bodies responding to music that spoke directly to something primal and universal, something that transcended the artificial barriers of class and privilege. As the first movement progressed through its complex development, Maggie's interpretation revealed layers of meaning that even seasoned musicians had never fully grasped. The agitated passages, where Rachmaninoff had poured his own struggles with depression and creative block, became a mirror for every moment of humiliation she had endured. Every cruel laugh, every dismissive gesture, every time she had been treated as invisible. But rather than bitterness, her playing conveyed a profound understanding of human frailty, a compassion that embraced even her tormentors. The chromatic passages that led to the movement's climax built with inexorable power, like a river approaching a waterfall, carrying the audience toward an emotional precipice they hadn't realized they were approaching. Brandon Hayes, whose iPhone had been poised to capture what he'd confidently predicted would be the most spectacular failure in classical music history, found his device trembling in his hands. The video he was recording, initially intended as content for his 50,000 TikTok followers, had become something entirely different. The comments flooding his live stream had shifted from cruel anticipation to awestruck reverence. "She's incredible. This is genius. I'm crying." His carefully curated image as a tastemaker in the classical music world crumbled as he realized he was witnessing artistry that made his own musical pretensions seem like children's finger exercises. The second movement's transition from C minor to E major arrived like dawn breaking over a battlefield, the string's slow chords providing a bridge between the storm of the first movement and the ethereal beauty that followed. When Maggie's piano entered with its simple arpeggiated figure, originally composed by Rachmaninoff as a separate piece years before he incorporated it into the concerto, the auditorium seemed to exhale collectively. The flute's introduction of the main theme, followed by the extensive clarinet solo, created a dialogue between orchestra and soloist that spoke of conversations between souls, of understanding that transcended words. Maggie's accompaniment during these passages was like silk supporting diamonds, providing the perfect foundation for the orchestra's melodic jewels, while never overwhelming or competing. Chelsea Morgan, whose influencer career had been built on documenting the failures and embarrassments of others, watched her phone screen with growing horror as her live stream's comments section turned against her. The cruel hashtags she had helped create, mop rat, janitor fail, were being overwhelmed by new ones. Genius, revealed, respect Maggie, classical queen. Her carefully constructed brand as a cultural commentator was dissolving in real time, as viewers recognized the profound injustice of what they were witnessing. The woman she had mocked and humiliated was revealing herself to be everything Chelsea pretended to be, a true artist, a person of substance, someone whose worth couldn't be measured in followers or brand partnerships. The concerto's final movement erupted with the energy of a 4th of July fireworks finale, the orchestra's short introduction, modulating from E major back to C minor before Maggie's piano solo announced the agitated first theme. But where other performers might have approached this movement as a mere display of technical virtuosity, Maggie infused it with narrative power that transformed every run and trill into storytelling. The fast passages became expressions of joy finally unleashed, of talent no longer hidden, of a spirit that had endured every indignity and emerged not broken but burnished to a brilliant shine. The lyrical second theme in B-flat major, introduced by oboe and violas, provided moments of breathtaking beauty that reminded the audience why classical music had survived centuries of changing tastes and cultural upheavals. As the development section unfolded with its improvisational quality, different instruments taking turns with the stormy motifs, Maggie seemed to conduct an invisible orchestra of emotions, her body swaying slightly with the music's ebb and flow. The extended passage built toward the recapitulation with mounting intensity, each phrase adding another layer to the musical architecture she was constructing. The audience, many of whom had attended countless concerts and galas, recognized they were experiencing something extraordinary. Not just a performance, but a revelation. The woman they had dismissed as the help was revealing herself to be a master of one of the most demanding pieces in the classical repertoire. The final climax arrived like a tidal wave of sound and emotion, the piano's triumphant chords in C major blazing forth with the power of vindication itself. Every note seemed to proclaim not just musical mastery but human dignity, not just technical skill but spiritual triumph. The 4-note rhythm that ended the movement, the same pattern Rachmaninoff had used to conclude his third concerto, rang out like a declaration of independence, a statement that true worth cannot be hidden forever, that genius will find its voice regardless of the obstacles placed in its path. As the final chord faded into silence, the auditorium remained frozen for 3 heartbeats, a moment of stunned recognition that they had witnessed something that would be remembered long after their designer gowns had gone out of fashion and their stock portfolios had been forgotten. Then, like a dam bursting, the applause began. Not the polite, measured clapping of social obligation, but thunderous, overwhelming recognition of transcendent artistry. 800 people rose as one, their standing ovation a collective acknowledgement that they had been wrong, profoundly, shamefully wrong, about the quiet woman who had just reminded them what music could be when it came from the depths of a truly great soul. The thunderous applause that had erupted from 800 stunned guests was still reverberating through Whitmore Academy's marble halls when the auditorium doors burst open with the force of destiny itself. The massive oak panels, each weighing over 200 pounds and carved with the Academy's century-old coat of arms, swung wide as if pushed by an invisible hand, their brass hinges groaning under the sudden pressure. Through that dramatic entrance strode a figure who commanded attention not through ostentation, but through the quiet authority that only true power possesses. Daniel Harrison, founder and CEO of Harrison Industries, whose $15 billion empire had revolutionized artificial intelligence and renewable energy across 3 continents. At 48, Daniel possessed the kind of presence that made boardrooms fall silent and stock markets fluctuate with his every public appearance. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly styled despite the late hour, his charcoal Armani suit tailored to perfection, but it was his piercing blue eyes that had stared down Fortune 500 CEOs and negotiated billion-dollar deals, that now scanned the auditorium with laser-like intensity. The crowd, still on their feet from Maggie's transcendent performance, found themselves caught between 2 moments of awe: the musical genius they had just witnessed, and the unexpected arrival of one of America's most reclusive billionaires. Whispers rippled through the assembly like electricity through copper wire. "That's Daniel Harrison. He never appears in public. What's he doing here?" Daniel's stride across the auditorium floor was measured and purposeful, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the marble with the rhythm of inevitability. The sea of designer gowns and tailored tuxedos parted before him as if he were Moses approaching the Red Sea, their wearers instinctively recognizing a force of nature when they encountered one. His eyes never wavered from their target, Maggie, who stood near the Steinway's bench, her simple gray dress still wrinkled, her cross-body bag clutched in her hands like a shield against the world's sudden attention. The contrast between them should have been comical. The billionaire tech mogul and the academy janitor, wealth and poverty, power and powerlessness. Instead, as Daniel approached her with a tenderness that transformed his austere features, the audience began to sense they were witnessing something that would redefine everything they thought they understood about the evening's events. "You okay, sweetheart?" Daniel asked softly, his voice carrying just far enough for the front rows to hear, his hand reaching out to brush a strand of escaped hair from Maggie's face with the gentle familiarity of long intimacy. The endearment, spoken with such natural affection, sent shockwaves through the crowd more powerful than any business announcement or market manipulation ever could. Maggie's response, a warm smile that lit up her hazel eyes, and a quiet, "Always, when you're here, Dan," confirmed what the audience was beginning to suspect but couldn't quite believe. The woman they had mocked, humiliated, and dismissed as invisible help was connected to one of the most powerful men in America, and their connection ran deeper than business or charity. Daniel turned to face the crowd, his arm sliding protectively around Maggie's shoulders, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention from world leaders and captains of industry. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, each word precisely enunciated and weighted with significance, "I'd like you to meet Margaret Thompson Harrison, my wife of 12 years, the heart of everything I've built, and the most extraordinary woman I've ever known." The revelation hit the auditorium like a seismic shock, rippling through the crowd in waves of gasps, dropped champagne glasses, and the sudden pallor that accompanies the realization of catastrophic error. Victoria Ashworth, still clutching her microphone like a lifeline, felt her carefully constructed world crumble around her like a house of cards in a hurricane. Her $15,000 Valentino gown, which had made her feel invincible just hours earlier, now seemed like a costume from a play that had ended badly. The color drained from her face as she processed the implications. She had spent months systematically humiliating the wife of a man whose annual donations to cultural institutions exceeded the GDP of small nations. Her lips moved soundlessly, forming words that wouldn't come, while her mind raced through the inevitable consequences of her cruelty. Professor Diana Whitfield's silk Hermes scarf, which had fluttered so elegantly during her condescending remarks, now felt like a noose around her throat. At 62, she had built her reputation on her ability to recognize talent and nurture the next generation of classical musicians. The realization that she had not only failed to recognize genius, but had actively participated in its humiliation, struck her with the force of a physical blow. Her perfectly manicured hands, which had gestured so dismissively toward Maggie just hours earlier, now trembled as she clutched the arms of her seat, her rings catching the stage lights like fragments of a shattered career. Brandon Hayes, whose iPhone had captured what he'd confidently predicted would be the most spectacular failure in classical music history, stared at his device in horror as he realized his live stream had documented not Maggie's humiliation but his own. The comments flooding his feed had transformed from cruel anticipation to righteous outrage. "You're disgusting. How could you treat her like that? Your career is over." His 50,000 followers were abandoning him in real time, his follower count dropping like a stone thrown from a skyscraper. The record deal his father had negotiated, the studio sessions that had been scheduled, the future he had taken for granted, all of it evaporating as the internet turned its collective fury on the young man who had made sport of genius. Chelsea Morgan's influencer empire, built on documenting the failures and embarrassments of others for the entertainment of her 100,000 followers, collapsed in the span of minutes. Her carefully curated brand partnerships, the luxury handbag company, the high-end cosmetics line, the designer jewelry collection, began sending termination notices to her phone even as she stood frozen in the auditorium. The hashtags she had helped create, Mop Rat and Janitor Fail, were being overwhelmed by new ones. Respect Maggie, your genius, revealed. Justice for artists. Her phone, which had been her weapon of choice in the war against dignity, now became the instrument of her own destruction. Daniel's assistant, Clara Martinez, appeared at his side with the efficiency of someone who had orchestrated billion-dollar acquisitions and hostile takeovers. Her sleek gray suit and tablet computer made her look like a general preparing for battle, which, in many ways, she was. "Sir," she said quietly, her voice carrying just far enough for the front rows to hear. "Shall I proceed with the funding withdrawal?" Daniel's nod was barely perceptible, but Clara's fingers flew across her tablet with the precision of a concert pianist, each tap representing millions of dollars being redirected away from Whitmore Academy. The massive screen above the stage, which had been displaying the Academy's promotional materials just hours earlier, now showed Harrison Industries' funding dashboard in real time. The numbers were staggering: $75 million in annual grants, $25 million in capital improvements, $15 million in scholarship endowments, all of it disappearing with the clinical efficiency of modern technology. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Whitmore Academy's financial lifeline was severed with the same precision that Daniel had used to build his empire. Board members clutched their programs like prayer books, their faces reflecting the dawning realization that their institution's survival hung in the balance. Edward Vance, whose pharmaceutical fortune had made him one of Boston's most influential donors, felt his own complicity in the evening's cruelty settle over him like a shroud. His earlier comment about Maggie being a charity case now echoed in his mind with the weight of profound shame. The woman he had dismissed so casually was not only married to one of his business rivals, but possessed a talent that made his own cultural pretensions seem laughably shallow. His wife, resplendent in her emerald gown and diamond necklace, avoided his eyes as she processed her own participation in the systematic humiliation of someone whose worth exceeded their own in ways that couldn't be measured in stock portfolios or real estate holdings. The reporters, who had arrived expecting to cover a routine cultural event, found themselves documenting one of the most dramatic reversals of fortune in recent memory. Tara Clean, whose live stream had initially been intended to capture Victor Sterling's triumphant return to Boston, now realized she had documented something far more significant. The moment when institutional cruelty met its match in the form of quiet dignity and hidden power. Her phone, which had been her tool for creating content at others' expense, now captured her own reckoning as she faced the reality that her career as a cultural commentator was likely over. The cascade of consequences continued to unfold with the inexorable logic of cause and effect. Elias Ford, whose viral videos had branded Maggie as Mop Rat, watched his music career disintegrate in real time as his record label sent a termination notice to his phone. The contract his father had negotiated, the studio time that had been booked, the tour that had been planned, all of it canceled as the industry distanced itself from someone whose cruelty had been documented for the world to see. His social media accounts, which had been his platform for tormenting others, now became the venue for his own public disgrace, as millions of users shared his videos with commentary that ranged from disgusted to furious. Megan Walsh's influencer career, built on a foundation of designer accessories and casual cruelty, crumbled as sponsors fled and followers abandoned her in droves. Her Gucci watch, which had gleamed so prominently in her content, now seemed like a prop from a play that had ended in disaster. The brands that had courted her, the events she had been invited to, the lifestyle she had taken for granted, all of it disappearing as the Internet's collective judgment fell upon her with the weight of divine retribution. As the full scope of the evening's reversal became clear, Maggie stood beside her husband with the quiet dignity that had sustained her through months of humiliation. She didn't gloat or demand apologies. Her silence spoke more eloquently than any speech could have. The woman who had been treated as invisible had revealed herself to be the most visible person in the room, not through wealth or status, but through the transcendent power of her art and the unshakable strength of her character. The auditorium, which had been filled with the laughter of the cruel just hours earlier, now resonated with the profound silence of the humbled, as 800 of New England's most powerful people confronted the reality that they had been catastrophically wrong about everything they thought they understood about worth, talent, and human dignity. The falling action of this dramatic evening would continue to unfold in the days and weeks that followed, but the moment of reckoning had arrived with the force of a tsunami, sweeping away pretensions and revealing truths that would reshape not only Whitmore Academy, but the entire cultural landscape of Boston's elite society. 6 months after that transformative evening at Whitmore Academy, Margaret Thompson Harrison stood in the sunlit atrium of the Hart Music Foundation, watching 12-year-old Marcus Williams from Chicago's South Side discover Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major for the first time. His small fingers, once uncertain on the keys, now moved with growing confidence across the pristine Steinway donated by Harrison Industries. The foundation had grown from a dream born in humiliation into a beacon of hope, serving over 500 underprivileged children across 3 states with completely free classical music education. Maggie's mother, now comfortably settled in the finest care facility money could provide, watched her daughter's teaching videos daily, tears of pride streaming down her weathered cheeks as she witnessed the resurrection of dreams she thought had died decades ago. The lessons learned from that night resonated far beyond personal vindication. True worth cannot be measured by job titles, designer clothing, or social media followers. It lives in the quiet dignity of those who persevere through adversity, who maintain their humanity when others lose theirs. For readers who have lived through their own seasons of being underestimated or overlooked, Maggie's story serves as a powerful reminder that talent, character, and grace shine brightest when given the opportunity to flourish. The foundation's motto, etched in bronze above the entrance, captured the evening's ultimate truth. Every soul carries a symphony. We simply provide the stage. Meanwhile, Whitmore Academy struggled to survive with diminished enrollment and funding. A cautionary tale about institutions that mistake privilege for worth and cruelty for culture. Have you ever been underestimated or dismissed because of your appearance, job, or background? Share your story of triumph over prejudice in the comments below. Your experience might inspire someone facing similar challenges today. If this story of resilience and hidden talent moved you, please hit that like button, subscribe for more inspiring tales of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, and ring the notification bell so you never miss our weekly stories of hope and human dignity.